Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi, and of late, Ukraine's recent lightning advance against Russia is raising the question of whether or not the Ukrainians may be actually able to defeat the Russians in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Now, there's of course the question of what retaliation the Russians could have, whether or not Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, may conscript regular Russians into this war. But for more on this rapidly changing situation in Ukraine, again, with the recent Ukrainian advance in mind, we're now joined by CU Denver professor Christoph Stevens for more on this. Professor, thanks for joining us. You've been with us several times throughout the course of this conflict. Can you just start by just giving us an assessment of where you think this conflict is at this moment in time?
Okay. Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me again. So I think the first and important development here is that the Ukrainians are advancing in the northeast, which is a very surprising development, a very positive development for the Ukrainians. They're not advancing as fast, actually a little bit stuck in the east and in the south of Ukraine. And we see actually counteroffensives by the Russians in the south. But the psychological moment here is very important for the Ukrainians. They can beat the Russians, they can beat back. They have made a lot of territorial gains, or like regained their own territory, we should say. And that has been certainly important. It has also larger repercussions for the international scene, as we see currently Russia losing international support quite a bit, which is also a positive development for the Ukrainians.
Well, you said it's surprising. Could you elaborate on just how surprising this is for you and perhaps for the world at large?
Well, I was the one who was wrong in the beginning of the war, where I thought that the Ukrainians would actually have to, lay down the weapons and essentially say, okay, the Russians won this war. But that hasn't happened. And I think many of the analysts around the world actually also expected that the Russians might, not win immediately, but, within months they would like slowly, move towards Kiev and win this war eventually. And now actually we have a situation where it is likely that the Ukrainians can actually beat back the Russians, and I don't think that many people expected that, me included.
Before we get into maybe some of those future prognostications, what could happen, could you give us an idea about what is driving the current run of success for the Ukrainians?
Well, I think that there are a few factors. Some are more long-term. For instance, that they were able to hit supply routes and bases of the Russians. Then on the other hand, the Western weapons have made a difference. So some of the weapons that have been used, artillery used or delivered by the United States, have been very successful. In other weapons by various Western countries have been used very effectively, and the Ukrainians have learned very quickly how to use them effectively against Russian major supply routes, but also against their own defenses. So that in a way is somewhat like it should give us some satisfaction in a way that the supply of weapons, of Western weapons to Ukraine has really made a difference, which was also not very clear. On the other hand, we can also see that the Russians are struggling. So it's not just the Ukrainians making headway here, it's also the Russians having major problems with supplying their troops, getting enough troops, trained troops, skilled troops on the battlefield. So it's a little bit of the Ukrainians gaining from the West and the Russians having their own several problems, and that has probably led to this current situation.
I guess one question that also seems to be coming to mind for many people is the fact that the Russians have one thing they haven't really used yet, is they have not conscripted their general population. There's been discussion about whether or not Vladimir Putin will or will not do that. A, what do you think will happen there? And B, what are the pros and cons for Putin about potentially conscripting or forcing into action members of the general population?
Putin is in a bind. It's a very difficult situation for him currently. On one hand, he has some right-wing ultra-nationalists who say, we need this full mobilization, everything, towards Ukraine. And on the other hand, you see the Russian middle class, urban middle class in Petersburg, in Moscow, who say, no, it's like, this is not actually a war that we really support. We don't. Just recently, one of the major Russian pop stars came out against the war, which is surprising. We see other people on talk shows actually coming out and say, well, maybe the Ukrainians don't really want to be united with Russia. So we see a situation where Putin is stuck. On one hand, the far right, the ultra-nationalists are demanding this full mobilization. On the other hand, Putin fears a political backlash that would come from this urban middle class. So far, soldiers who die, Russian soldiers who die in Ukraine, are usually not coming from Moscow or St. Petersburg, right? They come from Siberia, they come from ethnic minorities, so they don't really have political clout. But if the body bags come back to Petersburg and they come back to Moscow, then we know that Putin is in trouble, because then we might actually see a major opposition to Putin developing. Right now, he only has to deal with the far right, and he, kind of plays into, their demands. But a full mobilization, I don't really think that he can politically risk that.
Well, so what are his options at this point? He is maybe seemingly, this is certainly not going the way I would imagine that it's going for him. What are his options at this point?
His options only like in the long run. His hope is the winter, which is going to be extremely hard for the Ukrainians, but it's going to be also hard for the Western Europeans. Their gas prices already went up, like 3-4 times. Like I know from my home country, Germany, that the poor people cannot afford actually, so they need government support to actually pay heating through the winter. They're already right now in dire straits. So all of this is, of course, something that Putin loves to hear and loves to see, and hopes that the support, breaks down essentially. So he thinks that in the long run he can win. On the other hand, if the West continues to supply arms to Ukraine, provides them with economic support, the US military right now provides like real-time intelligence about troop movements and so on and so forth. If that continues, I think Putin in the long run doesn't really have a chance. But I think this is actually the game that he wants to play right now. Just wait and hope that Western support ends for Ukraine.
I know I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. What do you think happens over the next few months and through the upcoming winter?
That is very difficult to say, right? I mean, it depends on so many factors that I cannot foresee. There are the November elections in the United States. We don't really know who's going to win, on which platform. Do the Republicans really stand behind the president and his foreign policy, which they do currently, with some extent, of course. But if the elections go against Biden and Republicans who oppose the war in Ukraine or oppose delivery of American weapons and support to Ukraine, who happen? In Western Europe, we also have crucial elections coming up in Italy, for instance. Who knows how the Italians vote? I mean, this is all where Putin actually, these are the last hopes for him. My personal hope is, of course, that we as the West stand united behind Ukraine, because I personally believe that Russia is a real threat to international security, to the world order as it is. But would I say, yes, Russia lost this? No, I don't think that it's too early to say.
Another question that'll put you a little bit on the spot here. Let's say things don't go well for Putin over the next few months and the West does remain united, and Putin is cornered. does he, quote unquote, lash out? And what I mean by that is, does he turn more aggressive? Does he direct his ire more at the West directly? And again, getting a little dystopian here, does that involve potentially the use of tactical or regular conventional nuclear weapons?
I don't see that he will use military nuclear weapons, but what we have seen already, I think just in the last few hours, we've seen a Russian missile strike very close to a nuclear power plant in Ukraine, in southern Ukraine. So this is a different one than which one was in the news recently. And I think this is something that he's like kind of trying to pressure the West, say, look, I don't even have to use nuclear weapons. I can just, have another Chernobyl, the 1986 nuclear disaster in Ukraine. And I just sent, another nuclear cloud across Europe. But I don't think that the use of nuclear weapons is very likely. It's not impossible, but it's not very likely. It doesn't really make sense. Plus, I think, and we cannot. I mean, it sounds like that Putin could just say, "Okay, I use nuclear weapons," but there are like 3 levels of decision making within the Russian government. So it's not that Putin has the full control over the nuclear arsenal. There are at least 2 levels down Putin that will also have to agree to that. And I don't see that Putin right now is in a politically strong position. He has to maneuver much more carefully than in the beginning of the war, when so many more people inside his inner circle also were much more supportive of the war than they currently are.
Interesting. Well, that I suppose allows us all to breathe, at least in my case, a little easier there. Again, things maybe don't go well for Putin. How would he react in that situation? What would happen if, say, the Ukrainians push back the Russians, perhaps to the pre-war borders?
Mm-hmm. That depends on what are the pre-war borders. I mean, when we think about the war, we think about 2022, February 22. That's when the war started. But in fact, the war started in 2014, right, with the annexation of Crimea and the annexation largely of the Donbas region, Luhansk and Donetsk. These were, like the story behind it is always like, okay, there were like pro-Russian separatists, but there were very few pro-Russian separatists in these 2 regions, or the larger region of Donbass. But it was very much supported by the Russians. So the Russians started this war against Ukraine, and we have to be very clear about this, 8 years ago in 2014. So pushing back to the actual borders of 2014, that would be the best case for Ukraine. But I can see actually that Russia would be willing to go enter negotiations when they see that they might actually lose, and lose completely. That means lose all of these. So over the next few months, we would see if it's going to be a little bit of a back and forth. Both sides might actually be willing to negotiate. Of course, if Russia, is pushed back ever further, Russia will not, or the Ukrainians will not negotiate, because why would they, right? So a political situation can only, or like a political solution in the short term can only be achieved if both sides feel that they're stuck and that they cannot make any major gains in this war anymore. And this winter will be the decisive moment, I think, for this war.
Well, Professor Christoph Stivus, we appreciate a few minutes of your time and lending us your expertise about this admittedly complicated conflict, but certainly, I'll speak for myself here, that you've shed quite a bit of light on how this is going and how it could end. So thank you so much for your time here on 9 News Plus today, as always.
Thank you, Chris. Bye.